6th academic session. And in this session, we have as our speakers Professor C.D. Sebastian, who is the professor at the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at the IIT Bombay, Mumbai. Professor Smita Sirker, who is a professor at the Center for Philosophy, School of Social Sciences, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. And Ms. Suchitra Srivastava, who is a research scholar at the Department of Philosophy, Jadavpur University. And this session will be chaired by Professor Koshi Tharakan. I request all the esteemed speakers and Professor Tharakan to kindly come on the dais and start the discussion.
Good morning, everyone. As announced, in this session we have 3 presentations. I would request Professor C.D. Sebastian to start with his presentation. Professor C.D. Sebastian, was already introduced. He would be talking on emotions, empathy, and moral cognition, insights from the Bodhicaryāvatāra of Śāntideva.
Thank you, Professor Koshi Tharakan. My fellow speakers, Smita and Suchitra, and dear friends, it's a wonderful experience to be here in Ramakrishna Mission Cultural Institute. I express my deep appreciation and gratitude to Swamiji Maharaj, Varnananda, who is the secretary of the Cultural Center, Swami Śāntideva Maharaj, who the director of the guru of the Devya Ashram, and Swami Tatpradananda, in charge of the Ontological Studies Center, who invited us. I should keep on record that Swami Tatpradananda would not have known me. It is only because of Professor Nirmalya Narayan Chakrabarti who made it possible for me to come, and our association is very long. I was a graduate student doing PhD in BHU in 2000 or 2001, and we first met in Amalner, the Pratap first Center of Philosophy in India, Pratap Center of Philosophy, and our friendship, appreciation and admiration grew day by day, and I treasure our friendship. Thank you so much for inviting me to this wonderful seminar. And I come from Indian philosophy background, and this seminar was a learning process for me. I am the 16th speaker. So far we have 15 speakers, and if we add the guest speaker, Swami Śāntideva, and the keynote address of Professor Jonathan Kaneri, I am the 18th or 19th speaker. I've been taking note of everything. I have learned so much, so I am grateful to the organizers for this wonderful seminar, which is a learning process, learning thing for me. This is the outset I would like to say. And what I would like to present here, I'm taking the cue from Professor Amita Chatterjee, where she discussed about emotions as enablers of rationality. And I don't hold on to that position. Emotions are enablers. Emotion and reason, they go hand in hand when moral cognition comes. And that's my position. And my paper, the part I am going to give is a piece of my research that I have been doing last 10 years or so. If you look at my website, you will see empathy, emotion, and moral cognition. And that's my research area as of now. And if Madhuchandas and Professor Madhuchanda remember, before COVID, we had a seminar in Jadavpur. In that also I had similarly highlighted on 2-3 aspects of Buddhism, not Bodhicaryāvatāra, where emotion, empathy and moral cognition plays a major role. And this is that part of that continuing program. And I begin my paper. I will be confined to my time span. I begin with a couple of verses from Bodhicaryāvatāra of Śāntideva. This goes like this. May I be a protector of the orphans. Ananadhanam aham nadha. May I be a guide for the wayfarers. Sarthavakascha yayinam. May I be like a boat, bridge and causeway for those who wish to cross the stream. Parepsunam cham napūta setuha sankrama evacha. May I be a lamp for those who look for a lamp. Dibharthina maham deepaha. May I be a bed for those who need rest and sleep. Shaya shayarthinam. May I be a servant for those who want a servant to assist in the hour of need. Dasarthina maham dasah. Bhaveyam sarvadehinam. May I be a wish-fulfilling gem, pot of fortune and efficient medicine. Chindamanihi bhadra ghataga siddhividya mau aushadihi. May I be a wish-fulfilling tree and the cow that yields all that one desires. Bhaveyam kalpavrishasya kamadhenuscha dehinam. This is the one from the 3rd chapter. These couple of verses from the Bodhicaryāvatāra Śāntideva, which expresses emotion, empathy and moral cognition in a crystal form. In this paper, I argue that empathy plays a vital role in moral cognition. Moral cognition, by moral cognition, I mean the cognitive acts and judgments amounting to moral decisions. And that's moral cognition, what I mean in this paper. The cognitive acts and judgments amounting to moral decision. In the first part of the paper, I make a brief survey of empathy and moral cognition in the history of philosophy and show that current studies show the role of empathy in moral decisions. In the second part of the paper, I take into account the insights from the Bodhicaryāvatāra of Śāntideva, where Bodhisattva ideal pivots on empathy and social emotions, and they regulate one's empathetic attitude towards the other, facilitating the process of moral cognition. The first part, I would like to show something on emotion and moral cognition. As I said, this is a continuation of what Professor Amrita Chatterjee discussed, emotion and reason. Moral behavior has characteristically been considered to be a rational enterprise. The traditional examples of this view have been Aristotle and Kant. For Aristotle, a good person is the one who reasons about virtues, unquote. And this is from his, what is important here, for Aristotle, happiness is the highest good, and it is activity of the rational soul in accordance with virtue. In his Nicomachean Ethics, Book 6, Book 7, 1 to 10, Aristotle investigates the character states of and speaks of akrasia, literally lack of mastery. An attractive person goes against reason and acts on emotions and feelings, which is considered to be a weakness. for Aristotle in character. And Aristotle and Kant's categorical imperative in moral judgment was purely a rational activity. For Kant, requirements are based on rationality, moral requirements. And his theory of categorical imperative is based on reason. Kant's rational take on moral cognition is found in the ground work of Metaphysics of Morals. The section 1 of the groundwork, the Metaphysics of Morals, explains, I quote, transition from common rational to philosophical cognition. So reason was of paramount importance to Kant. Locke too had argued that moral cognition is based on rational standard. Locke would say that moral person is a corporeal, rational creature, quote and unquote, in his book 3, chapter 2, section 16 of Locke's Essays Concerning Human Understanding. Rational explanation of moral behavior assumes that moral cognition is based on a conscious weighing of different rules, norms and factors, whereas emotional explanation emphasizes the influence of feeling and emotion in making moral cognition. Debates and developments in philosophy and psychology of emotions, thank you, and feelings in the last 3 decades have brought to light many dissimilar claims and views. The philosophical traditions associated with Anglo-Saxon world and common sense psychology have a propensity to talk about the human mind in terms of belief, desire, dissection. Belief, desire, intention, action, if we remember. And according to this school of thought, feeling does not have any philosophically significant role, whether epistemological, metaphysical, or ethical. For that reason, feelings and emotions are defined are mere, I quote and unquote, subjective colorings and feedbacks, bodily goings on and happenings. And they do not have a quote and unquote directions, as ratio does not come into it. Now, Pratik and Abhishek can hand over the handout, because this is some references are there of recent researches. The handouts are there. This is only for the bibliography. Yeah, I follow the handout which you have in your hand. Notwithstanding the views aired and shared by the traditions of Anglo-Saxon philosophical world and common sense psychology on feelings and emotions, there are writers in contemporary philosophy of emotion who argue for a different status to feelings and emotions in philosophy. They emphasize the role of ratio even in feelings and emotions. They argue that feelings are vital in moral cognition, where knowledge claim is of paramount significance. Further, feelings can be intentional and they can go beyond bodily goings on. Though empathy has much to do with emotion, empathy is a conscious enterprise where one adopts someone's emotional state while maintaining the self-other difference. Empathy is a caring morality which develops an ethics of empathetic caring. Hume, in his treatise of human nature, asserts that sympathy, and the bracket as the term empathy had not developed till 20th century, sympathy augments our moral obligation. In 1759, Adam Smith published his first work, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, which is a didactic, analytic and exotic text that lays the psychological foundation on which his 1776 masterpiece, The Wealth of Nations, was built on. In it, Smith described the principles of human nature, which together with Hume and other leading philosophers of his time, he took as a universal unchanged dictum from which social institutions as well as social behavior could be deduced. Smith saw humans as being self-regulated by the capacity for sympathy. This aspect of human nature provides them with moral faculties to create institutions by which the destructive struggle can be mitigated and even turned to the common good. An empathetic motive base is that empathy defined as an affective response more appropriate to another situation than one's own. We have a number of studies. This is what I would like to give in the handout. Number of studies in the last 3 decades which shed light on the role of emotion, particularly that of empathy in moral cognition. One of the recent studies on neural activity associated with the different facets of moral thought has shown the moral cognition is related to empathetic attitude. I quote, ultimately, our results support the notion that the moral reasoning is related to both seeing things from one's own point of view and grasping others' feelings. An account of justice in relation to empathy is the subject matter of work by Matt Edge. I have given the reference. Empathy arousing process could be well instilled in socialization, as different studies have shown, which will lead to a moral cognition. Now I come to emotion and empathy in Buddhist paradigm, Buddhist view. Buddhist perspective, if analyzed carefully, is not a deontological nor consequentialist ethics, but it is a virtue ethics. And you know, my conviction, my inclination as a student of philosophy is towards virtue ethics. And if you want to see virtue ethics in its full embodiment, one has to turn to the Buddhist ethics. The Upanishadic ethics is either deontological or consequentialist. The Gita ethics is either deontological, karmanyeva adhikaraste ma phaleshu kathachana, either deontological, but all these are having a consequentialistic outlook. Virtue ethics per se in Indian philosophy, if one wants to fathom, one has to do some deep study in the Buddhist ethics, and Buddhist ethics is that. The virtue theory is in the West may well be found in Aristotle with the conception of eudaimonia in his Nicomachean Ethics, but the Buddhist virtue ethics is older than that of Aristotle. The virtue theory pay close attention to the role of the emotions in ethical affairs, assigning it an important role in moral education and moral life. Virtue theory generally thought to have the richest moral psychology of the major moral theories, as reason, important for me, as reason, appetite, emotion, and affect all play vital role in the mental life of an effective moral agent. One of the recent studies published in PLOS 1 is, Public Library of Science, which I am coming from IIT because that's one important open access journal. In PLOS 1 show that there is a kind of relationship between moral judgment and empathetic concern in particular, that's feeling of warmth and compassion in response to someone's distress. The study showed that the utilitarian participants showed a significantly reduced empathetic concern on an independent empathy measure. The findings therefore reveal the diminished empathetic concern in utilitarian moral judges. Among the philosophical traditions of India, one finds Buddhism as one of the most robust systems where empathy plays a dominant role in moral cognition. One can posit a transformative phenomenology in the Buddhist paradigm. And the Bodhisattva ideal, as seen in the Bodhicaryāvatāra of Śāntideva, is a catalyst for the same. Let me have, for our students, those who are listening to me, let me have a word on Śāntideva, because I admire Śāntideva so much. Let me have a word on Śāntideva. The historical records available to us about the life of Śāntideva is very scanty. According to Buddhist historian, Tibetan historian, Bhutan, Śāntideva was the son of King Kalyanavarman of Saurashtra in Gujarat. Mind you, Ujjain was a center of Buddhism. Gujarat was a center of Buddhism. The entire Gujarat belt produced many Buddhist philosophers. Till 10th century, it had a long intellectual climate of Buddhist philosophers, Ujjain, Malwa region, as well as adjoining Saurashtra region and Maharashtra especially. So, according to Buddhist historian, King Kalyanavarma of Saurashtra, he renounced his future kingship, fled to Nalanda, and took to monastic life. Śāntideva flourished during the period of spanning the end of the 7th century and the first half of the 8th century. Probably his flourishing time is 695 to 740-43, like that. Śāntideva belonged to the Prasangika branch of Madhyamika school. Professor Sirker is an expert in Madhyamika Buddhism. People make a distinction even in the Madhyamika, Prasangika, and who are the Prasangika things? That is Buddhapalita and Chandrakirti's school, and where our friend Śāntideva comes after Chandrakirti. Prasangika branch of Madhyamika school. The two works of Śāntideva is Siksha Samuchaya and Bodhicaryāvatāra. They are considered to be the two most popular works of entire Mahayana literature. The Bodhicaryāvatāra was composed by Śāntideva at Nalanda University sometime at the beginning of the 8th century. And let me say something about the Bodhicaryāvatāra, because what is there in the text is an empathetic person, empathetic bodhisattva, doing everything because of his emotional attachment. It's not the passionate attachment, emotional attachment of empathy, empathetic attachment. He or she lives, works, and gives the entire life for the welfare and well-being of the other sentient beings, not only human beings, all the sentient beings. This is very important. That's it. And what is this Bodhicaryāvatāra? It's a beautiful text of 913 verses in 10 chapters. And the first chapter is all about the benefits of bodhicitta. And the second chapter is all about the purification of one's mind to get that bodhicitta. And the third chapter is all about what one has to get the correct procedure to get that bodhicitta. And the fourth chapter is the awareness and the restrictions and restraints one should have to stop impairing the bodhicitta one gets. Then chapter 5 is, there are Shat Paramidas in Mahayana Buddhism, 6 Paramidas, perfections. And the next chapter is Shila and Dana is explained in the 5th. 6th is Chanti, forbearance is explained. And the next one, the next chapter is the 7th chapter, the Virya, the courage, and courage is explained. Then Dhyana, Prajna Paramida, and the 10th chapter is all about how one should live for the welfare and well-being of others with this bodhicitta. That's what entire thing of entire Buddhist literature. This text, this is a beautiful text. And if you know Sanskrit, it is better to read in Sanskrit because the translations are not that up to the but we understand the nuances of words, and it will be wonderful. And this is all about Bodhicaryāvatāra. This is a beautiful text. The Bodhicaryāvatāra it stands as one of the greatest classics of world philosophy and Buddhist literature. And it is enormously influential in Tibet, where it is regarded as the principal source of ethical thought of Mahayana Buddhism. Am I exceeding my time, Professor Koshi? I should wind up now? I will just summarize. My paper is a very long paper. One more paragraph I read, then I summarize. You will give me 3 minutes? 2 minutes?
Take 3 minutes.
Okay. In the text, Bodhicaryāvatāra, the Bodhisattva idea sheds light on the facets of emotion, empathy, and moral cognition. The Bodhicaryāvatāra Śāntideva, as Garfield, yesterday he was there, Garfield writes, stands as one of the greatest classics of world philosophy and Buddhist literature, unquote. In the text, one finds Śāntideva exhorting the readers and his Buddhist fellow religionists to make efforts to upkeep the welfare and well-being of other sentient beings to reduce suffering. The Buddhist moral outlook, which we find in Bodhisattva ideal and its doctrine, is the ethics that seeks to solve deep existential predicament, the problem of suffering. The most important invention of the text is the installation of compassion, Mahakaruna, as the fundamental moral value and prototype of Bodhisattva's empathetic engagement with the world as a moral ideal. The fundamental moral value of compassion that the text sheds light on is not a reflexive emotional response, nor a sheer desire. Instead, as Garfield states, it's a genuine commitment manifested in thought, speech, and action to act for the welfare and well-being of all sentient beings. I summarize. The Buddhist paradigm is all about not the I. In the Buddhist paradigm, the primacy of we dominates. Yesterday, Dan Sagvi had the same. Because my existence is grounded in the we communitarian aspect. All the similes in the Bodhisattva ideal. Take the case of the boat and the boatman and the travelers. The boatman goes along with the people to the other shore and he gets off with everyone, a Bodhisattva. Similarly, a shepherd makes sure that he or she reaches the sheepfold. After that, he gets off. So there is no individual liberation for anybody in the Buddhist paradigm. If every sentient being is liberated, then I also will be liberated. Till that time, till that day, I have no liberation. A communitarian outlook, the primacy of we. Second is the Pratiti Samutpad, is the core of Buddhist understanding, because it doesn't look at individual existence as one reality. The Upanishadic view of Ekam Evam Advitiyam is a mithya-dishti, it's a mithya-ditti for the Buddhists. You are equally real, I am equally real, the rivers, the plants, the sentient beings, everything is equally real, and we exist in relation to each other. And our existence is an individual existence where we celebrate the differences and pluralities. Everyone has her or his own domain, individuality, and I cannot abnegate one's individuality and selfhood, whatever you want to say, at the altar of the oneness. So the oneness reality, the holism of the understanding is antithetical to the entire doctrine of Pratiti Samutpada. Yo Pratiti Samutpadam Pashyati. Anyone who sees Pratiti Samutpadam, he understands what is Madhyaprati, what is the teaching of Buddha. That's it. Then the Buddhist, one more point is there, then I think I will stop. And if in the discussion, if there is something coming, I will tell you. And what I wanted to say is that moral cognition, acts and moral acts and judgments, cognitive acts and judgments are based on one's empathy. And that's what my research on, and I'm convinced of that, if others are not convinced. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Sebastian. Yeah, the paper is open for discussion questions. I can see 3 hands, so we will take these 3 questions. Yes, please.
I have one, first of all, thank you very much for your informative presentation. I have one simple question. You have quoted one statement from Bhagavad Gita and rest from Buddhism, based on Buddhism. So between these two, which one do you feel the best as a human being we should follow? At least for me.
I shall not sit on a value judgment on the texts. I teach that also. When I teach Gita in my place, I become a teacher of Gita. When I teach Nagarjuna, I become an exponent of Nagarjuna. And, you don't ask me which is better. That's...
You have that knowledge.
No.
Yeah.
Chairperson Jadavpur, thank you.
Thank you, sir, for your elusive deliberation. We know the word anukrosho, to whom empathy derived in Mahabharata, in Indian school. But in Western school, is there any connotation regarding empathy? If so, what's the difference between sympathy and empathy in Western school, and is it lying on Rawls' theory of justice to Carol Gilligan's care ethics?
I will not come to explain what is the positions of the Western scholars on empathy and sympathy, but I can explain to you in the Buddhist paradigm. Is it enough?
Yeah, please.
That's enough. Because, don't ask me, because there are other scholars in Western philosophy. In Buddhist paradigm, the empathetic nature is not sympathy. You don't stand on a high pedestal and look at the misery of the others and you give something. No. In Buddhist paradigm, the empathetic person gets out of that high pedestal, if he or she is, put on the shoes of the other one who is in that position, and travels with that person. This is empathy. That's Mahakaruna. And there is no higher status or high pedestal for a person who feels empathetic. You have to put on the shoes of the other and walks along with. And even you may have to be in the dirt, but you may have to uplift. And there is a beautiful simile in Ratnagotra Vibhago Mahayana Uttarandhara Shastra. The child is in the pit of dirt. It is in the pit. The Bodhisattva jumps into it, gets dirty with the dirt, but lifts up the child and places. And she remains or he remains there. And after some time only he comes up. But means there is no higher status for a empathetic person.
Thank you, Professor Sebastian. I think for a want of time, we will stop here. Any discussion, we can have it later outside. May I now invite the second speaker, Professor Smita Sirker, who teaches at Jawaharlal Nehru University, please.
Very good afternoon to everyone. I would just like to start by expressing my heartfelt gratitude to the organizers, Tadvratanandaji Maharaj and Professor Nirmala Narayan Chakraborty for giving me this opportunity. The title of my paper is Reflections on Self-Knowledge and Moral Agency. I'll try and stick to the time. Okay. This paper will explore the interactions between self-knowledge and moral agency on the basis that self-knowledge, our knowledge of our own of our own states of mind, is a primary requirement of our moral agency in making rational moral choices and decisions. And that connection is seen as a part of the process of moral assessment of one's own decision and choices based upon her beliefs, values, and commitments. Our moral life evolves within a normative domain constitutive of moral values and moral commitments, involving the process of making rational moral choices. Human beings are, as moral agents, make rational choices, as Bilgrami says in Self-Knowledge and Resentment. The reflection is on the question of how we become moral agents. Alternatively, can we become moral agents without the capacity of being self-reflective? Unless a moral agent is aware of her own moral beliefs, commitments, and values, can she engage in making moral decisions and choices of any kind? Self-knowledge, at least in an implicit sense, about one's own beliefs and desires, be it moral, normative choices, and commitments, constitutes an integral part of being a moral agent. The notion of moral agency is not simply about making choices, but what conditions determine the moral choices of a person, and the complexity lies in the interplay between self-knowledge of one's own moral beliefs, values, commitments on one hand, and how such knowledge leads to moral decisions on the other. It is probably in certain tough moral contexts, like in case of moral dilemmas or moral conflicts, that a moral agent navigates consciously about one's own moral beliefs, values, and commitments, thereby having self-knowledge of one's own repertoire of beliefs, desires, etc. in an explicit sense. The resultant self-knowledge from the process of self-reflective awareness and reflective self-evaluation shapes the development and progress of moral character. Moral agency, I think, does not, or rather cannot, emerge unless there is a kind of moral reflective capacity to form second-order desires, beliefs, to evaluate the moral worth of first-order beliefs and desires. This capacity, though often implicit, comes through the processing of our own intentional states, which constitutes what we call as the knowledge of one's own self. Self-knowledge, or self-reflective and self-evaluative process of awareness of one's beliefs and desires, enables the individual to process and connect the network of belief-desire set with one's desired or performed actions. It is natural to think that a moral act is preceded by one's knowledge of what I ought to do. A morally responsible person knows what she is doing, aware of her intentions behind a certain act or behavior. We therefore want to lay out the relationship between self-knowledge and morally responsible agency via the requirement of moral freedom. The freedom to act implies that the agent has full knowledge of one's own act. Bilgrami argues that freedom of actions necessarily involves self-knowledge. The thesis of determinism posits the physical causal necessitation of the world, which includes human actions and entails that effects necessarily follow from their antecedent or prior causal conditions. The prima facie impediment to free will and moral responsibility stems from the assertion that all our actions are causally necessitated, foregoing the possibility of free choice of actions by the agents and the absence of genuine alternatives, whereby one can exercise selection even if the available choices are just two. One main argument compatibilists put forward against the position is that quote-unquote absence of causal necessitation as a condition for freedom indicates a misunderstanding. As freedom requires the absence of coercion or compulsion in the acts or decisions of agents. Compelled or coerced actions, when produced without or against the agent's wills and desires, cannot constitute free actions. Traditional compatibilism contends that freedom of will is essential to moral responsibility. The former requires alternate possibilities, choice to do otherwise, and moral responsibility is not in conflict with the thesis of determinism. As we know, traditional incompatibilism counter-argues that the truth of determinism entails the falsity of having genuine choice, the possibility of doing otherwise, as only the presence of freedom of will makes possible alternative choices and actions available. Thereby, they bring the compatibility between determinism and freedom of will into question. A causally determined worldview, according to incompatibilists, impedes the metaphysical possibility of freedom of will, and unless we can posit freedom of will, the ascription of moral responsibility will bear no implication. Thus, human responsibility seems incompatible with causal determinism or universal causality. These positions manifest sharply contrasting takes on the nature of the association between determinism and free will, or the possibility of freedom and responsibility in a world governed by the principle of causality. Akhil Bilgrami in Self-Knowledge and Resentment notes that the principle that human responsibility is incompatible with universal causality is both a shared principle as well as the point of departure for the compatibilist and incompatibilist positions. Compatibilism in its broadest sense claims that the truth of determinism does not undermine human freedom to choose and do otherwise, and therefore we can be held morally responsible. We can be held as morally responsible agents. The Humean argument, as Bilgrami points out, suggests that causal determinism as such, even in the context of human actions, is not problematic for human freedom and responsibility, as the threat to the latter is implicit in a particular property of causal conditions present in some but not all cases, and are properties of being coercive causes. The coercive character of a cause risks freedom of human actions, whereas the non-coercive character of a cause does allow freedom. Non-coercive actions are caused by desires, intentions, or beliefs of the agent, devoid of any coercive influence or compulsion. In our attempt to comprehend how, through moral intuitions, we make moral choices, decisions, and evaluations, there is no immediately given normative structure that grounds all our ordinary intuitions. The fact that we talk about moral intuitions to judge the moral viability of an action or decisions cannot be without self-reflection on what is leading us to that decision. Why at all do we arrive at that choice? Moral intuitions necessarily involve self-reflection into one's own intentional states. Our decisions regarding moral appraisals and ascriptions of moral agency, largely on some kind of preliminary identification and categorization of acts as coerced or non-coerced, thus of coercive or non-coercive causes. An act under coercion which undermines control of the agent over her decision and act will in all probability immediately give rise to the question of whether she can be held responsible for her act or for her decision. Thus, one is drawn into separating unfree acts and their coercive causes from free ones and their non-coercive causes in order to locate freedom and responsibility. The underlying assumption is that unless one acts freely, one cannot take the act to be intentional, grounded in one's belief desire set, and therefore an act for which one holds oneself responsible, both in its choice and in its execution. In absence of freedom of agency, there cannot be any rightful ascription of responsibility. We want to highlight in this presentation, simply put, is what makes an agent a morally fit agent open for moral evaluation. The response comes partially from Strawson, followed by Bilgrami, in their respective arguments about the criteria for moral assessments and judgments from a third-person perspective of the moral agent. Bilgrami points out that despite this distinction between coerced and non-coerced acts and their causes, an incompatibilist may still pursue their basic objection, which he refers to as quote-unquote what about question, that ask for the philosophical ground or criterion for our intuitions concerning free and unfree acts. What is it about a cause that makes it coercive or non-coercive? To simply say that some causes are coercive and some are not fails to give an adequate explanatory basis for the distinction, since both are causes. A similar lack of clarity on the basis of our intuitive understanding of the distinction between free and unfree actions reflects the absence of an adequate criterion for the separation and categorization of coerced and non-coerced actions. For once again, they are simply caused. Thus, what is lacking is a philosophical basis for such categorization. Bilgrami thinks that one can find ways to respond satisfactorily to the what about question in Peter Strawson's essay, Freedom and Resentment, though Strawson does not raise or deal with the question explicitly. Bilgrami goes on to show that how the Strawsonian account can address the question vis-à-vis the incompatibilist objection of the whatabout against the human position. Strawson argues that the property of being coercive or non-coercive is not implicit in any cause. Rather, it is determined by the reactive attitudes of people towards a particular action of a person or an agent. One cannot, by merely looking at the cause, be aware of its coercive or non-coercive nature. The alternative approach to the question concerning the ascription of moral responsibility, one which weighs on the Strawsonian suggestion of reactive attitudes, offers a kind of descriptive account of actual human psychology, taking a closer look at what actually goes on when we hold a person responsible. Strawson argues for a compatibilist stance, albeit not in complete resonance with traditional compatibilists. The compatibility of determinism and moral responsibility is shown by suggesting that our ordinary practices of holding people responsible and taking moral reactive attitudes towards them would hold even if determinism is true. What Strawson terms reactive attitudes, such as guilt, resentment, indignation, admiration, gratitude, etc., provide the key to understanding moral responsibility and their conditions. In Strawson's emphasis on the importance of emotions in our moral life, one detects a methodological shift from conceptual analysis to moral psychology. Strawson is clearly not pursuing a metaphysical notion or understanding of human freedom, since he argues for a completely different starting point grounded in our empirical practices. Strawson focuses directly on reactive attitudes, which are emotive responses that play a fundamental role in our practices of holding one another responsible. If reactive attitudes are an integral part of interpersonal relations and social practices, they are, in a certain sense, constitutive of our moral thinking, particularly of our moral reasoning, involving moral assessments. So appraisals would instinctively be prompted by the reactions we have towards the intention and attitude that the agent displays. So we pay attention not merely to the act itself and whether or not it meets certain norms and further what consequences it produces, but all the usual factors that we ordinarily take into consideration in judging its moral worth. But for Strawson, we also attach much importance to the intentions and attitudes the agent manifests towards others. The combination of act and consequence is not the only referential dot that one connects in a normative judgment about the moral worth of acts. All factors mentioned above are taken as reference points and coherently brought together in our adjudications, thereby constituting a consistent basis for any evaluation. Bilgrami explains that for Strawson, the freedom of action is a presupposition of our practices surrounding responsibility and the reactive attitudes that underlie them. To blame or to resent another is intelligible only to the extent that she is capable of reaction, and the blame and resentment only target those free actions. To blame or resent a particular action is to presuppose that it has been freely enacted. Bilgrami's extension of this insight is that free and accountable human action in this Strawsonian sense in turn presupposes that each such action is also self-known. And if that is so, the intentional states, whether conceived as commitments or dispositions that potentially go into the production of such action are also self-known. So self-knowledge constitutes a necessary condition. Bilgrami says, and I quote, "Any intentional state of mind of a human agent that tied or potentially tied to her actions which are the potential targets of justified reactive attitudes, is necessarily known to the human agent. We cannot justify having reactive attitudes to actions, intentional states that are not self-known. And he also goes on to say certain features, 5 characteristic features of these reactive attitudes. And I will not read all 5, but I'll read the first one, which he says that these reactive attitudes that we often display to other moral agents is also directed towards us. We also kind of evaluate the kind of desire, the kind of values, commitments that we have. So he says that these reactive attitudes can be directed to our own selves, where we feel guilt, remorse, or pride based on the nature of our acts or decisions. So he argues that there is a reversal in direction between pre-Strawsonian and Strawsonian approaches in deciding between coercive and non-coercive causes, agential freedom, and ascriptions of responsibility. The traditional approach begins with the determination of the presence or absence of coercive causes of actions, thereby deciding whether the act was free or otherwise, and then goes on to decide the nature of moral ascriptions. Thus, only when the nature of the cause is determined do we move forward to determine the freedom of agency and the possibility and content of moral ascriptions. The Strawsonian approach, on the contrary, begins with the nature and degree of our reactive attitudes, reactive evaluative attitudes that we form on the basis of the agent's intention, belief, attitude towards others and ourselves, along with the consideration whether the agent has awareness of our own intentions, thereby deciding whether the act was free or not, and whether the action was coercively or non-coercively caused. Bilgrami thinks that this is where Strawson brings a new perspective on the problem of freedom and freedom of action. Our decision to distinguish causes in this particular way, as Bilgrami points out, is based on normative considerations. Issues concerning free will are about the conditions for holding people responsible, and to regard people as responsible agents is to be ready to treat them in certain ways, to adopt certain reactive attitudes towards them, such as resentment, admiration, gratitude, etc., even approbation, forgiveness, etc. To be responsible, Strawson argues, is to be, quote unquote, fit subject. The agent has to be fit enough to have such reactive attitudes, to ascribe such reactive attitudes. It is to partake in a form of life or moral community in which people can appropriately take such reactive attitudes to one another and thus hold each other responsible. How does one decide on the fitness of a moral agent? We will address this question in a bit. So, returning to the incompatibilist objection concerning the absence of a philosophical basis of the what about question, Bilgrami notes that the same concern can be reflected even in the Strawsonian thesis. He proposes a probable rejoinder that can be construed from within the Strawsonian understanding. As we noted, a criterion that demarcates coercive from non-coercive causes cannot be located within the cause itself. There is nothing specific to the cause that determines its coerciveness. So for Strawson, the manner in which we may identify a cause as coercive or otherwise depends on our reactions or evaluative responses to the actions performed under those causal conditions. If we respond to an action via reactive attitudes such as resentment, anger, pride, or admiration, then this indicates that the act is a free act caused by non-coercive causal conditions, where the agent freely and knowingly takes her decision and act. On the contrary, if we excuse an act or be indifferent to it in spite of its harmfulness, then that shows the act is unfree, caused under coercive conditions, or where there was absence of the agent's awareness for the consequence of the act. So without self-knowledge of one's own intentional states can one justify and rationalize one's action? Okay, I'll just wind up within 2-3 minutes. We can excuse or exempt individuals from responsibility under certain conditions, such as having acted in ignorance or having done what they did by accident or unintentionally or from insanity. Strawson describes these circumstances in which we are compelled to withdraw or suspend our reactive attitudes towards other individuals. There are two important types of such excuses. I'll just say them in brief. In particular circumstances where the agent's conduct lacks any ill will or disregard, and some injury may have occurred inadvertently or unintentionally. And second is, in particular circumstances where the agent is somehow an inappropriate object of any resentment or regard, as she may be abnormal or immature, right? I don't explain this anymore if it comes. Okay. So the question is, the absence of ill will or malicious intention evokes a non-emotive evaluative reaction, and one goes to the extent of excusing the bad consequence of the act. In the latter set of cases, however, the excuse is made not due to the absence of free will or malicious intention, but the lack of a certain capacity. This is what is important, a certain lack of capacity or ability on the part of the agent herself. The agent becomes an unfit or inappropriate object for emotive reactive evaluations. So to consider someone accountable or responsible is to be ready to treat her in certain ways and adopt certain attitudes towards her. So let us formulate the question in the context of moral ascriptions a bit differently. The philosophical issue concerns the nature of the freedom condition for moral responsibility. The question is, what is it to be a morally responsible agent? One may ask, what are the conditions for a morally responsible agency? Aristotle talks about two conditions, an epistemic condition and a freedom condition. What becomes important in this context is the epistemic condition. For an agent to be morally responsible for what she has done, she must have had some understanding of, or at least she must have been able to understand the moral significance of her behavior. For Strawson, in cases where we do not ascribe moral responsibility to individuals and do not consider them as targets of moral blame or moral praise, individuals who are, quote unquote, inappropriate objects of our reactive attitudes, we find an absence of this epistemic condition. The individual is not cognitively equipped to understand either the moral significance of our behavior or the complex social matrix within which she operates. However, in cases where the agent is not unfit as a moral agent and commits a wrongful or rightful act without ill intentions or good intentions, we excuse the agent from moral blame or praise on the ground that the agent's sheer ignorance, not having any knowledge about the act or its consequences, not otherwise. The justification for excusing the agent is not due to the absence of epistemic condition, but the fact that the agent did not display any ill intention towards others, which otherwise would have triggered reactive attitudes on our part. I guess I'll stop here if questions.
Thanks, Professor Smita. The first, yeah. Can you please raise your hand? Yeah. The mic. Yeah.
Is a child's will that made her commit terrorism that was caused by her trauma of war as a child free?
Well, a child of what age? I mean, do you mean of a certain age? I mean, I can keep calling an adult person a child because of certain ignorance that he shows, but what I mean to say is that if we are talking about acts of terrorism, and if we are talking about a person who is responsible for that act, and if we try to kind of relate to his traumatic experience of his past, but still someone has to be held morally responsible, even if that cause is some kind of traumatic experience. But I think as a rational person, the person at some point would be able to see what consequences his action would lead to. He can't be completely discounted of his responsibility.
Yeah.
I'm just asking if it's free.
Oh, if it's free. Yes, I think it is free. I mean, because all of us has a certain kind of personal history, and so we are in a way determined by that personal history. But we do reflect on that personal history. We do reflect on our choices that we make based on that personal history. So for me, I think we are free agents to a certain extent, if not obsessively driven by a certain prior condition. Otherwise, I think we are free. Yes.
Thank you. Yeah. Professor Giri, last. Can you, Professor Giri raised the hand first before you.
Thank you so much. You have gifted us many dimensions to this field. For example, one of the issues is the third person perspective. Now, understanding third person perspective, we can also look at the issue of contingency and what is called as triple contingency vis-a-vis the double contingency of the self and the other. So it is in that context, how do we look at moral action when it is part of a field of contingency, but contingency, of course, not devoid of immanence and transcendence. My second quick query
is... we will take one question because there are others also. I will request you to take it outside the...
I think I have to discuss this question with him because I didn't understand the full import of the question. I'm not quite certain what you mean by this triple contingency. So unless I have a clear idea about that, I won't be able to come up with a response. Reasonable response, I would say.
Maybe this is the last question. Okay.
Thank you, madam, for the nice presentation. My question is, some actions are free and some are not. Is it possible to distinguish between them in court of law? It is legally very important from your perspective.
Well, I'm not a legal person, but I guess lawyers do find ways to separate, categorize free from unfree actions.
Actually, law sees the consequence. Law actually, what law sees, they say during the act, whether the person knows what the consequence is going to be. If he knows it, then law holds him responsible.
You see, it's not that simple, because if you take a case of murder and the person who is killing the other person knows about the consequence, because he is attacking the other person, but whether it was a coerced act of attack or a non-coerced, whether it was an act of self-defense or otherwise, is something that the whole context will determine. So it's not just about the consequence. I'm well aware if I'm trying to kill a person,
punishment may be diluted, but he knows the consequence, he will be punished.
Let's not extend it to a discussion. We will take it later. Yeah. Last question.
There are differences between institution and organization on the basis of ethics and judgmental activities, practices. So the indigenous population anywhere throughout the world, and the difference with the mainstream population, the urban elites or the urban middle income class, or even the rural background. Is it like that the traditional people, the indigenous people, are more adhered to their particular age-old practices and they are more morally advanced than ours, and the thing is even percolating to the rural areas even.
I do understand your question, but I think it's also an empirical question that one has to go to that population and see what their ethical practices are. And
the ethical practices
yes,
after all. Because we are restricted to the internet sensation on discussing about a topic and not doing it further on.
Because I think that we are all rooted in certain cultures, in certain value system, you know. I mean, you can't pick out a person who is completely value-free. So in a way, but your question is how deep-rooted we are.
Exactly.
And that is an empirical question which I can't really take a position on. We all are rooted, but I think as my training goes, that being a rational agent, you know, we always are open to critically analyze the value system. It is given to us, no doubt, but we do have the disposition to critically evaluate, critically analyze the values that we are thrown into. Right?
But the mainstream people are more involved in the instantaneous activity.
We have one more paper to present. Don't extend it to sub-questions and discussions like that. Thank you, Professor Smita. May I invite now Ms. Suchitra Srivastava, please. Yeah, sure, please. Ms. Suchitra is a research scholar in the Department of Philosophy at Jadavpur University. She would be talking on the role of language in emotional experience.
Thank you, Professor Tharakan. I offer my pranam to the Swamijis and a very good afternoon to all the professors, distinguished speakers and guests and participants present here. This is my first time speaking in front of such an audience, and I'm immensely grateful to Professor Nirmala Narayan Chakraborty and Ramakrishna Mission Institute of Culture for this wonderful opportunity. Tickled as I am, I'm also nervous, so please do bear with me during the course of the paper. Without further ado, I'll now start presenting my paper titled The Role of Language in Emotion Experience. That which we call a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. Or would it? Shakespeare's verse is so highly quoted because it captures something curious about language in human minds. We take for granted that language communicates our perceptions to others. But what if language also helps constitute those perceptions in the first place? Although Juliet surmised that language is just for communication, recent studies are beginning to suggest otherwise. That is, a flower might indeed be perceived as sweeter by virtue of being categorized a rose. What about emotions, though? What about love, anger, fear, jealousy? What about expressions of emotions that ring true in our daily lives? What do I really mean when I say, I can't help falling in love with you? This fills my heart with joy unspeakable. I was driven by anger, struck by jealousy, felled by shame. Emotions, surely, constitute a very important part of the human system and condition, and their communication is indeed vital for individual development and the community. But could it be so that this communication through language actually shapes our emotion concepts, which in turn shapes our emotions? Common sense tells us that language does not have much to do with emotion. Certainly, what people say affects our feelings, and we may use words to explain our emotions after their occurrence. However, the relationship between language and emotion is generally believed to end there. This common sense viewpoint is shared by many contemporary models of emotion. Emotions, according to these perspectives, are bodily types, distinct from language or mental processing. Yet, growing research points to a deeper role of language in the very having of an emotion. So the purpose of this paper is to determine just how profound a role does language actually play in emotion experience. And to achieve this purpose, I would like to divide the paper into 4 sections. First, I would like to provide some background on emotion research, just to give an idea on how emotions have generally been understood throughout the history of philosophy. With this understanding of emotions, I would delve into the role of language in emotion experience, which is further divided into 3 sections, namely language and emotion concepts, metaphors and emotions, and narratives and emotions. I would then conclude by bringing in tandem the insights from and implications of all the aforementioned aspects to get a picture of the nature of emotions. Section 1, Background. If you were to look at the map of emotion research and philosophy, you would discover that two major themes characterize the study of emotions. One is the identification of emotions as intentional states of the mind, that is, states of the mind directed at or towards some object. This, as we all know, is the cognitive theory of emotions. And the other is the identification of emotions with feelings. This is known as the non-cognitive theory of emotions. So on the one hand, emotions are conceived of as principally cognitive states, and on the other, as principally affective states. The non-cognitive theory of emotion, having its founder in William James, states that it is the collection of bodily changes that mark or define an emotion as that particular emotion. And an emotion is not anything over and above this summation of bodily changes. On the other hand, all the cognitive theories of emotion agree in taking some form of evaluative judgment as an essential element of an emotion. And it is this component by which one type of emotion differs from another. For example, when you have contempt for someone because they have behaved badly, you judge the person to be low or unworthy of your esteem in view of that behavior. However, when you're angry at someone because they have behaved badly, you judge the person to have injured or insulted you by so behaving. So we see in both cases, the cause is the same, but the judgments are different, leading to different emotions. Now, because emotions somehow seem to be represented on both sides of the mind-body divide, a strong cognitive or non-cognitive theory fails to provide a complete account of emotions. For a strong cognitive theory fails to account for what we call the phenomenal aspect of the emotions, and a non-cognitive theory fails to explain the intentionality of an emotion. Therefore, many modern and contemporary philosophers have developed what we call hybrid accounts of emotions, in which they attempt to demonstrate that an emotion is a mixture of both phenomenal and intentional components. These theories, however, share a common fate with theories of the mind-body problem, in that they struggle to reconcile two features that are so diametrically opposed to one another and are of different kinds. But do these characteristics, however, really stand in such stark contrast? Does the dichotomy between evaluations and feelings really hold? Is the term intentional feeling really an oxymoron? All these are concerns that will be covered later. Now that we have a basic understanding of how emotions are viewed in philosophy, let us move to the heart of the paper, the role of language in emotion experience. So this brings me to section 2, which is language and emotion concepts. The idea behind this paper is that language helps shape emotion concepts, which in turn shapes emotions. To understand this in better light, I'm going to draw on evidences from psychologist K.A. Linguist's work on emotions. Linguist puts forward a model called conceptual act theory, also known by the acronym CAT, to understand and explain the relation between emotion and language. With evidence from developmental and cognitive science, CAT suggests that language scaffolds concept knowledge in humans, helping them to acquire abstract concepts such as emotion categories across their lifespan. So basically, CAT proposes that emotion concepts are abstract. That is, they do not have a single category prototype to define them. They are not like concrete categories, for example, an apple, that have strong perceptual regularities. For example, apples are round, tart, crisp, fruits that grow on trees, and clear best example prototypes. For example, a red delicious apple. Emotion categories, on the other hand, exist as populations of conceptual information that might not be covered by a single best example category prototype. Therefore, emotion concepts arise out of extrapolation from various instances, combining a number of factors like the cause and consequence of, and typical verbal and non-verbal behavior and linguistic practices associated with the emotion. And words for emotion categories like anger, disgust, fear, etc. serve as the glue or a sense placeholder that helps bind together otherwise diverse instances of a given emotion category. In order to better comprehend this, let us look at emotion development in children. As infants become verbal toddlers, their concepts become honed through bidirectional communication with caregivers. In light of this, it is interesting to note that children do not learn how to reliably categorize facial expressions of different emotions, say anger, disgust, fear, etc., as distinct until they acquire and begin to use those words to describe those categories in conversation. So, when 2-year-olds are given a set of pictures depicting 5 emotion categories and are asked to identify them, they place all unpleasant faces, angry, sad, disgusted, fearful faces, in the angry category. Yet, as 3- and 4-year-olds begin to acquire the concepts sad and fear, they demonstrate an ability to perceptually categorize unpleasant faces into more specific emotions. And by the age of 7, children show adult-like perceptual categorization of most faces, save disgust. So this experiment displays what I would call a language superiority effect in categorizing facial expressions of emotions. The more intriguing part is that other research demonstrates that labeling one's own unpleasant feelings with emotion words causes an experience of a particular discrete emotion to occur. This is consistent with my claim that recognition of emotion and having of that very emotion might go hand in hand, at least in certain cases. So individuals who were exposed to labels for the category fear prior to listening to some unpleasant music are subsequently more likely to engage in behaviors typical of fear than individuals who were exposed to other or no emotion category labels at all prior to listening to the same unpleasant music. Not only that, studies suggest that labeling one's affective state as an emotion also alters cardiac responses. Thus, labeling an unpleasant state as one type of emotional experience versus another can shape how it is subsequently experienced, thus lending support to my assertion that linguistic categorization is not only intrinsic to the identification of the emotion, but also to the very having of the emotion. Now, there's a host of experiments and evidences in favor of the import role of language and emotion, into which I shall not delve because I have so much more to cover. But what's important is that all these experiments demonstrate that language helps humans acquire and then use concept knowledge to make sense of their experiences and perceptions. So the power of language to shape emotion is thus increasingly evident in light of these facts. Now I shall move to the third section of my paper, wherein the relationship between language and emotion will perhaps be understood in a more nuanced manner, which I personally find to be very intriguing. It has to do with the relation between metaphors and emotions. With little reference to the work of George Lakoff, I'd like to present my own understanding of this multifaceted, layered, and complex relationship between language and emotion. So here we go, section 3, metaphor and emotions. Metaphor is for most people a device of the poetic imagination and the rhetorical flourish, a matter of extraordinary rather than ordinary language. Moreover, metaphor is typically viewed as a characteristic of language alone, a matter of words rather than thought or action. Because of this, most people believe that they can get along perfectly well without metaphors. Lakoff, on the contrary, asserts that metaphor is pervasive in everyday life, not just in language, but also in thought and action. Our ordinary conceptual system is fundamentally metaphorical in nature, and how we think and act every day is very much a matter of metaphor. To give some idea of what it could mean for a concept to be metaphorical and for such a concept to structure in everyday activity, let us look at the metaphor, time is money. You're wasting my time. The gadget will save you hours. How do you spend your time these days? The flat tire cost me an hour. I've invested a lot of time in her. Time in our culture is a valuable commodity. It is a limited resource that we use to accomplish our goals. Because work is typically associated with the time it takes, and time is precisely quantified, it has become customary to pay people by the hour, month, or week, or year. Thus, we understand and experience time as the kind of thing that can be spent, wasted, budgeted, invested, saved, or squandered. The essence of metaphor is understanding and experiencing one kind of thing in terms of another. It is not that time is a subspecies of money. They are different kinds of things. Yet, time is partially structured, understood, and talked about in terms of money. The language is metaphorically structured, and in turn, the concept too. Now, what about emotions? Are emotion concepts also metaphorically structured? Turns out they are. To understand this in better light, let us look at some examples. Let us look at the metaphor, anger is a hot fluid in a container. She is boiling with anger. He is making my blood boil. Simmer down, would you? He really blew his stack when he heard about the theft. Now let's take up the most popular emotion of all, shame. Shame is having no clothes on. I felt so naked, so exposed. Shame is hiding away from the world. I wanted to bury my head in the sand. I wish the ground would just swallow me up. Shame is a decrease in size. I felt this big. The last one is an example of a spatial metaphor. Spatial metaphors are crucial in understanding and explaining emotions. This intense role of spatial metaphor in understanding what it feels like to have the emotions that we do could further be illustrated by this very self-explanatory and lucid poem, Spaces They Fill. In the depth of my being, they say, in my guts, they say, in the heart of my heart, they say, in my bones, they say, spaces where pangs are felt, pricking, soaring, shrinking, boiling, shaking, fear, love, shame, rage, awe, indignation, jealousy, and gratitude for having spaces to be filled with these. For anyone wondering, this poem is written by my supervisor, Professor Madhuchanda Sen. She wrote it for me a while back. Now, all that we discussed so far are but a few examples of the countless instances wherein emotion concepts are structured metaphorically. But what does this really tell us about the fundamental nature of emotions? William James, the father of non-cognitivism when it comes to emotions, in one of the most famous passages in the history of emotion research and philosophy says, and I quote, "If we fancy some strong emotion and then try to abstract from it all of its characteristic bodily symptoms, we find we have nothing left behind. No mind stuff out of which the emotion can be constituted. And that a cold and neutral state of intellectual perception is all that remains." James's argument does seem to go hand in hand with common sense. But what if we have a similar counter-argument from the cognitivist perspective? Based on what we've learned about the nature of emotion concepts, we can construct a similar argument against this. If we take an emotion, say anger, and remove from it all of its metaphorical usage or all of the metaphors that define it, would I truly be able to understand and explain what it feels like to be angry? These metaphors assist us in making sense of all the judgments and bodily feelings that occur during the experience of an emotion. They assist us in articulating those judgments and sensations, thereby assisting us in experiencing discrete emotion episodes. So what is anger, if not a synthesis of all the metaphors we use to describe it? Can I define anger in terms other than what I get from these metaphors? Again, it is important to note that I am not dismissing the role of the body in an emotion experience. Rather, what I'm looking for is a feature that will help me identify an emotion as that particular emotion and distinguish it from other kinds of emotions. And this is precisely where metaphors come into play. Furthermore, the point I want to make here is that identifying an emotion as a specific emotion causes a discrete emotion episode to occur, and language helps in this very identification. Thus, we see that language is not only a reflection of the experiences, but it also creates them. Simply put, we say what we feel, and we feel what we say. I now move to the fourth section of this paper, where I would discuss how stories, among other modes of language, influence our emotions. Frankly, this is so intense, it could be a paper in itself, which I'm also developing, but for now, I would just like to touch on this issue as it fairly reinforces my claim. So, Section 4, Narratives and Emotions. Nearly as long as humans have been able to communicate, we have had this innate inclination to tell stories. Storytelling is ingrained in our DNA, regardless of whether it developed for a specific purpose or was merely a byproduct of our rapid cognitive development. Stories have been of value throughout history and throughout cultures, not only as artistic creations or for recreational purposes, but as agents of personal development. As the popular saying goes, people don't remember facts and figures, they remember the stories. It has been intuitively clear for thousands of years that tales affect our way of thinking and, in turn, the way we interact with the outside world. We debate with tales, either silently or aloud. We retort, we laud, we condemn. Now, epics, as we all know, are one such format for relaying tales. But how are epics philosophically relevant to the theme of this paper? Part of what makes an epic is the fact that it provides the reader with a panoramic view of life. To put it simply, makes them experience a wide range of human emotions. In epics, we see a wide variety of emotions, both with positive and negative valencies in their extremes. For example, we see that the characters in the Mahabharata are not stoic, detached, and indifferent to the situations happening around them. They are vulnerable to those situations, and they are affected by the feelings of pride, joy, revenge, and grief. Now, based on this intense emotion-ladenness, it would therefore not be wrong to call an epic an emotional symphony. But why are these epics so popular? It is because they do not just display a wide range of emotions. They are not just descriptive in nature when it comes to emotions. They effectively teach us how to deal with emotional conflicts. We learn from them ways to live. Whether Ved Vyas was a cognitivist when it came to emotions is of course not clear. What is clear, though, is that in the Mahabharata, we do see a very lucid message on emotions and choice. The Mahabharata, through the course of its narrative, tells us how to choose our emotions wisely and act on it. Because whether it is Kunti's fear of shame and humiliation that makes her decide to abandon her child, whether it's Duryodhana's anger and frustration, or whether it is Bhishma's rigid righteousness, all of these, as we know, contributed to the war. What's important to understand is that it is the quest for a decent life, the pursuit of an ethically rewarding life, the pursuit of a life of virtue that has been the fundamental motivation for turning to epics for guidance. And these epics have thrived for so long because they invoke in us virtuous emotions in their purest forms. They reinforce qualities like piety, fortitude, sacrifice, honor, and selflessness. They put forward a scenario of emotions and choice in front of us and are thus replete with cognitive understanding of emotions, in that they resonate with 20th century philosopher Solomon's adage that emotions are essentially judgments and are not just automated responses over which we have no control. Another reason why these epics have lasted so long is because they generate in us a special class of emotions called collective emotions. Now, what are collective emotions? Let's understand with an example. When, in Egypt in 2011, thousands of Egyptians gathered in Tahrir Square, they collectively expressed their anger, frustration, and contempt against Mubarak's political regime by shouting, chanting, and gesturing. Thus, collective emotions are emotions shared interpersonally among members in a group or culture. The collective emotions generated by epics are sustained, and they not only lead to actions like individual emotions, but also to the formation of identity, culture, or an emotional climate. It would also not be wrong to say that communities, more often than not, live by these epics. On the one hand, some collective emotions, so generated, lead groups to act in altruistic and productive ways. For example, Kirtans, Kathas, and Aartis performed collectively foster a sense of brotherhood and unity among members of the community. On the other hand, collective emotions generated by these epics also lead groups to violent and destructive outcomes. All of us in this room are well aware of how collective emotion towards Lord Rama's Janmabhoomi or birthplace has triggered a chain of events in our country with serious ramifications. Without furthering the discussion, I would just like to say that whether or not these emotions are warranted or unwarranted, justified or unjustified, is not the area of focus of this paper. What is important, though, is to understand that collective emotions, generated often by stories, last longer and can have stronger impacts than individual emotions. There is also a plethora of philosophical discourses that come along with collective emotions, like that on personal identity, collective and shared consciousness. But I would not divagate into that. So we see how all these sections demonstrate how language in its various modes has helped shape our emotional life. Section 2 demonstrates how language alters emotion perception, experience, and regulation. Section 3 brings out how pervasive metaphors really are in our emotional life. Section 4 highlights how tales cause emotions that can last for generations and move us in ways that probably individual emotions cannot. But what does this interplay between language and emotion experience actually tells me about the nature of emotions? It is precisely this. Emotions are not just the fortuitous residue of fickle evolution. They are in themselves strategic and political. To put it differently, and somewhat controversially, emotions do not just happen to us, as the whole language of passion and being struck by would suggest. They are, with some contentious stretching of the term, activities that we do, stratagems that work for us, both individually and collectively. So emotions are not as raw, unbending, and as untutored as they once typically seemed to be. They are rather molded and shaped across one's lifespan. In the beginning, I stated that whether it is at all possible to rise above the dichotomy between evaluations and feelings and provide a unified theory of emotions is what lies at the heart of recent philosophical discussion on emotions. But is there at all a dichotomy between the two? In an attempt to answer this, I would just like to point out that every emotion can be viewed from different perspectives, and it has different aspects, like behavioral expressions, physiological aspect, phenomenological aspect, the cognitive aspect, and the social context. These aspects are systematically interwoven, and they should not be construed, as they often are, as competing conceptions or even as components of emotion. An emotion is a holistic phenomenon. So there is really no unidirectional flow of experience of an emotion and then expression of it. Rather, feelings, language, agency, communication, and cognition are tied in unison to produce emotion episodes. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Suchitra. Yeah, Professor Guha, yeah. The mic behind you. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
So we have 3 questions already. First, Professor Maushmi, then Professor Sangeeta, and Sir.
Thank you, Suchitra. I'm feeling so happy and so proud that you are our student.
Thank you.
It was a wonderful paper. I have just one very brief question for you, which might be related to the work you're doing. Would you say, particularly considering your section 3 on metaphors, would you say that some kind of an embodiment hypothesis would be necessary to your work on emotions.
Yes,
if
ma'am.
you bring metaphors into the picture.
It would be. Because metaphors, they sort of give us those concepts, those embodied concepts as well, embodiment concepts as well. So there are a lot different kinds of metaphors to understand emotions, and most of them are embodied concepts also. So the role of embodiment in understanding emotions is very important. But actually, ma'am, I think the claim that I'm wanting to make is that I'm not denying that there is this intense role of the body in experiencing an emotion. Perhaps emotions typically involve feelings. Maybe they essentially involve feelings. But that is not a point that I want to contest. What I am trying to say is that how would I identify an emotion as that particular emotion and distinguish it from other kinds of emotions? So this is where I feel language has a big role to play. But I would really like to delve further into what you just said. I really have to study more on that. So thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
Professor Sangeeta, yeah. Here, front row.
Thank you, and I think I will join the professor there in saying this is one of the brilliant and very lucid papers I have listened to in this conference, also for our empathy in using language in a way others will understand. And I think that's very important in communication, that your listener need to know what you are saying. I mean, that's the side comment, but and I look forward to having a longer conversation with you. But in short, in emotional expressions of experiences like shame, a lot is attributed to the self. And it's extremely difficult to even articulate what that self is. So in emotions, like self-conscious emotions, like shame, guilt, etc., language itself becomes very complex in its articulation. That's one thing which I wanted to mention. And the other reflection which I was having in mind when you were speaking is, for example, the examples which you gave, like boiling in anchor or simmer down, that's because we have a very explicit emotion which is really boiling there, right? But on the contrary, look at an experience of silence. Yeah, I gave that moment for all of us to experience that, because that's one experience where words literally fail. Literally with an underline. So how do we understand silence in the context of language as an experience? Can it exist without language at all? Or maybe it exists only without the language, because the moment you use any kind of words to describe silence, it's no more an experience of silence. And the third point, and I'll make it very short, Dr. Koshi, is a lot of emotions develops, progresses, and diminishes over a period of time, lifetime, and most of it becomes accrued in what we call as our personality. So certain emotions which exist perhaps over a period of our life disappears at a certain age and stage of our life. So from that point of view, maybe we can even say that emotion by itself perhaps do not have an ontological existence, but maybe only by being in the context of a lifetime. Absolutely. And a life perspective which we develop over time. Once again, congratulations for a beautiful lecture.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you so much for that wonderful insight on silence. I would love to read more on it. Thank you. And the third point that you said, it is actually very similar to a claim that Peter Goldie makes. He's an emotion theorist. And he says that to make sense of one's emotional life, one's emotions, you have to look at their entire life. You cannot just look at discrete, isolated episodes of emotions and make sense of what emotions are. So it is along the same lines that you were talking about. I'm sorry, I'm really nervous. Just attending questions.
The last question, Professor.
Yeah.
Just one thing, correct me if I am wrong. I thought I heard you saying somewhere that all our language is metaphorical, something like that. Now, I have just one point to mention here. Adjectives are significant if they are applicable somewhere and not applicable somewhere. Because the task of adjective is to distinguish something from something else. If it is omnipresent, it fails to be an adjective. So you see, such sweeping statements make me a bit skeptical. But otherwise, I wish I had a student like you. I can only say this. I was telling Nirmala that I am growing envious of Madhuchanda.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. Sir, I would just like to say that I was explaining lack of understanding of concepts as metaphors, and it is a very categorical claim that Lakoff makes. He says that, you know, our thoughts, our conceptual system is innately metaphorical in nature. Now, I don't agree with his conception of metaphors, but I was just bringing out the fact that he so beautifully brings out that metaphors, we usually, when we think of metaphors, we think of poems. We don't think of our everyday lives. But metaphors are generally pervasive in our everyday lives too. Yeah, but that you are absolutely right in saying that he makes a very categorical claim. That is true. But that's not, those are not my words, those are his.
Just add one thing. You see, this is not no further question. What I said was stated by Kumarila Bhatta. Sambhava Bhavicharabhyang sad visheshanam arthavat. A visheshana or adjective becomes significant by two things. Sambhava, there should be some possibility of its application, and Bhavichara, there should be places where it is not applicable.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you.
With this, we are concluding this session. Yeah. I thank all the three speakers. They have actually, touched upon very important dimensions of the conference, starting with the relevance of virtue ethics, referring to Śāntideva's work, then the role of self-knowledge, underpinning our moral agency, again referring to Bilgrami's work and Strawson's work, and lastly the role of language in shaping emotions and how emotions in turn get shaped. So once again, thank you all the speakers, and I apologize for my rude interruptions of some of the questioners, because that's there is an object placed in front of me which I see, which is not visible to you. That's the only constraint. Okay, that's the only reason. Once again, thank you all. Yeah.